Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 36 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Edmonton Oilers and lost by a score of 3-2 in the overtime. And the Sharks have faced off against a lot of great teams thus far this season, as you would expect 36 games into the year. Florida, Minnesota, Washington, Winnipeg, all teams right at the top of the NHL standings, and the Oilers are really no different, just another tough challenge on the road of this season for the Sharks. But they are a bit more of an interesting team to actually keep an eye on, not necessarily for the Sharks players or the Sharks coaching staff, but actually from a Sharks management perspective, from Mike Greer's point of view, because it is quite noticeable just how similarly the Sharks are being built over these last couple of seasons to how the Oilers have done it over the last decade. The Oilers are led by a generational talent coming out first overall in the 2015 draft, tons of speed, tons of skill, right down the middle of the ice with Connor McDavid. The Sharks are hopeful to get at least something similar out of their last first overall pick just a few months ago, Macklin Celebrini, and he has had a great start to his career. Then the Oilers have right down the middle as well, that 1-2 punch with Leon Draisaitl. Definitely doesn't have the same level of speed as a Connor McDavid, but very similar in terms of actual talent and skill. Draisaitl, a very patient player, slows the game down, protects the puck well, and is still one of the most dangerous players in the entire NHL. The Sharks hopeful to get something like that with Smith. Maybe not quite the same size and strength as what a Draisaitl does show off, but Smith falls in that same category as not really being the fastest player, but has a ton of very soft abilities to be able to find players with his elite vision. Even from the back end, the Oilers have Evan Bouchard, a London Knights prospect, or a London product, I should say, with that big booming shot from the point. The Sharks something similar with Sam Dickinson, also out of the London Knights, also with that big booming point shot. So the Sharks have that same type of pieces in place to try and in 5 years' time be where the Edmonton Oilers currently find themselves. So I don't know if this is just a coincidence how it has worked out as such, but the Sharks definitely hoping that they can end up with a similar result with those top two centers and that big number one defenseman. The major difference between the Sharks rebuild and the Oilers rebuild is actually between the pipes. The Oilers have never really quite found a forever goaltender for their team. They've gone through Cam Talbot, Mike Smith, Jack Campbell. Currently, the I guess experiment is with Stuart Skinner, but none of these goaltenders have necessarily ever really been all that great, and rarely have they been viewed as a future long-term player for the organization. From a Sharks perspective, however, they have a player like that, that being Yaroslav Askarov, and we saw here tonight just how much of a difference a great goaltender can bring to a game, because the Sharks, they got crushed here tonight. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. The first period was all right, but once that second period came along, it was just utter domination from the Edmonton Oilers, and the only saving grace here for the Sharks throughout much of the last 40 minutes was Yaroslav Askarov doing his absolute best to keep the Sharks alive in this game. He is the one who earned the Sharks the singular point here tonight, even though they do not end up coming out with the victory. So indeed, on that similar rebuilding path, but they've got that little extra secret sauce between the pipes with that Askarov pickup who could very well make all the difference in the future. When it comes to this game, we start off in the first period. The Sharks actually come out with a lot of energy to open up this game, and it reminds me a bit of what I mentioned a couple of games ago against the Winnipeg Jets, which was a game in which the Jets really weren't playing all that bad, or the Sharks just actually had some strong jump in their game, and so that's why it was quite competitive. Here tonight is actually slightly different, because while I'm not going to take any credit away from San Jose, the Oilers were very slow to open up this game. It was a pitiful effort from the Edmonton Oilers in the first 10 or so minutes of this one. The only player who was actually skating hard for them was McDavid. It picked up a little bit as the first period went along, but the Sharks were still actually better for much of these 20 minutes, and it shows on the scoreboard. They get the goal from Luke Cunnin. It's tied up by Zach Hyman, but then Jan Ruda has his first of the season, and it is a 2-1 lead at the end of the first. In the second period, the Sharks have usually been actually pretty good over these last few games in the second period. Not the case here tonight. The Oilers pile on 23 shots on net in this one, but thanks to a bit of puck luck, the Oilers had some empty nets here to shoot at and somehow managed to miss a couple of times, but also some insane goaltending from Askarov. The game is actually still kept with a 1-goal lead for the Sharks, and so they once again, familiar situation, head into the third period with a lead, and honestly, the third period was an improvement over the second. They looked a little bit more competitive. By the first 10 or so minutes, not great, but they started to actually get some chances generated in the offensive zone. Their first, their second, and their third line each had, I believe, one at least, maybe even a couple of offensive zone shifts near the end of this game. They came pretty close to actually getting an insurance goal and making this 3-1, but they can never quite find the back of the net again. And then the Oilers, they come on in these last few minutes. They start to load up. The immense amount of talent that the Oilers can throw over the boards in these types of situations with both McDavid and Draisaitl on the ice is so difficult to contend with. And while the Sharks do their best to hold on, it is in the last 17 seconds when Mattias Ekholm scores, ties this game up, and we then head to the overtime. The Oilers are literally the best team in the entire NHL when it comes to the 3-on-3 overtime, not necessarily from a this season perspective, but just generally over the last few years. And it's because they can send on McDavid and Draisaitl and just absolutely dominate teams because of it. They score within just the first few seconds of this overtime, and they take the game 3-2. The Sharks, they end up with that 1 point, but they obviously would have liked a better result since this is yet another game where they have a third period lead and end up on the losing side of things. When it comes to the players to talk about, I would normally start with the Sharks' first line, but I'm actually going to start with the Sharks' second line of Kovalenko and Toffoli because I absolutely want to start the conversation here with Macklin Celebrini, because Celebrini, he has gone through the trials and tribulations thus far this season. There have been a lot of learning experiences for him when he goes up against a team like the Dallas Stars or the Minnesota Wild, who play a very suffocating level of defense. Florida, Tampa Bay, also amongst those. But this was definitely an interesting game for Celebrini to take a look at because of that player on the other side of the ice, Connor McDavid, is something that I'm sure any player in the NHL really wants to strive to be like, but Celebrini in particular, to watch what McDavid is able to do, not just coming through the neutral zone with his speed, that's always highly touted, but what he's able to do in the offensive zone to control the pace of the game is extremely impressive and better than anybody else in the entire NHL. The fact that he can have 3, 4, 5 defenders looking exactly at him and what he's going to be able to do, and he's still able to make up plays consistently, either shots towards the net or just cross-ice passes to completely wide open players. I mean, the easiest job in the NHL has to be a winger on McDavid's line because of just how often he's going to be able to find you with these types of passes. And so it is definitely going to be a process here for Celebrini to watch that, to go back. And I think this is going to be a game that's actually filled with a lot of regrets for Celebrini, because the first period was all right for him. The second period, he really didn't get to find many openings, but it was the third that was really a difference maker for him because he got multiple great chances here tonight. He had a sort of breakaway off of a pass from Kovalenko, but he gets saved by Picard. Then he has a great chance off of a William Eklund pass where he shoots this one wide. Then he gets another great chance just a few seconds later where he is again robbed by Picard. These were 3 opportunities, grade A at that, to get the insurance goal here for the San Jose Sharks. And this isn't any fault of Celebrini. You're not sitting here and saying, well, Celebrini needed to put up a better effort, but it is definitely something that's going to weigh on him just with how competitive he is as a person. And especially when we look at late in the third period, he's on the ice for the dying seconds of this 6-on-5 situation for the Oilers. He was hopeful to be able to get his stick on both the pass to Corey Perry and then the immediate pass right after to Mattias Ekholm, who is the goal scorer here, but he misses both of them, and that ends up with the game-tying goal. Again, it's not so much Celebrini's fault. You would have liked this puck to have gotten cleared out just a few seconds earlier when the Sharks had the chance. But it's definitely something that Celebrini is going to let hang in his head. And then on top of that, he gets the first shift in the overtime. He wins the faceoff with a very strong effort. He comes in one-on-one with Evan Bouchard. He tries to make the play, however, and loses possession of the puck. And if there's one thing that you do not want to do in the overtime against the Edmonton Oilers is lose possession of the puck when McDavid and Draisaitl are on the ice. That is literally the only counterplay to these two players being here. You need to be able to hold possession, and Celebrini gives it up, and it leads to this Leon Draisaitl goal. So again, all in all, I would say Celebrini was still one of, if not the best forward for the San Jose Sharks here tonight, just based on the chances and the effort that he put up. But it is definitely the type of game that I'm sure Celebrini is sitting there and thinking, I could have done so much more here to secure this victory. When it comes to his 2 line mates, they were definitely steps below Celebrini here tonight. Tyler Toffoli did actually get a lot of puck touches, at least in the earlier parts of this game, but I don't really think he did a lot of very good things with it. Later on, he would only get a couple of other moments, and I thought defensively he made a couple of decent plays, but then a couple of really bad ones as well. He had one really good play, which was to actually set up this 2-on-1 situation for Kovalenko and Celebrini early in the third period, where, as I mentioned, Celebrini could have gotten that goal. All in all, I don't think Toffoli was horrible here tonight, but it wasn't a great game. The same would go for Kovalenko. He continues to manage to find some great setups in these games. There were a couple of times, the 2-on-1, of course, I've already mentioned multiple times, but even a different moment as well was a great play for himself. And he won some battles here tonight. On top of that, he had a great chance to shoot, which he was then robbed by Picard, so it's nice to see him actually get those shots off. But I thought all in all, I wasn't super impressed with what Kovalenko was able to do here tonight, so it was a decent game, but definitely, again, paling in comparison to the center on this line, Macklin Celebrini. Then we move on to the Sharks' top line to get back there, which is the reuniting of the Lund line. Finally, there's no more Barclay Goodrow on the Sharks' top group. It's Granlund and Eklund being joined by Fabian Zetterlund. And this line, it has been the case in which they have been hemmed into their own zone in each of these last couple of games. Goodrow was a part of that, but so have been Granlund and Zetterlund. Here tonight, it was, again, a lot of struggles there for sure when you're going up against McDavid and Draisaitl consistently and your team is just struggling to clear the zone thanks to your defense, who's just not great at moving the puck. It can be tough, but I actually did appreciate the effort of a couple of these players. First of all, I'll go with Mikael Granlund, who I thought had a lot of fight in him here tonight. Sure, there wasn't a ton really happening offensively. He didn't really get to do much in the offensive zone, but his coverage of McDavid and Draisaitl here tonight was actually very admirable. There were multiple moments where he was able to separate these players from the puck and actually get some good clears. And so I actually thought Granlund was one of the Sharks' better defensive players on the night for sure. The same would actually go to William Eklund. Not quite at the same level of Mikael Granlund, but I still appreciated some of the defensive effort he was able to bring. Eklund was also one of the very few players who was actually able to get any sort of offensive chances in the last 40 minutes of this game, so appreciative of him there as well. And when it comes to Fabian Zetterlund, as is usually the case when he's on this Lund line, he's kind of the weak link. There wasn't much to be excited about defensively from him. He had a couple of good blocks at the very least, but not much else besides that. And then offensively, he didn't really do much either. And so kind of a quiet game for Fabian Zetterlund in a game, honestly enough, was just kind of not great for the Sharks as a whole. So he's certainly not like a standout bad player or anything like that. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, we have Wenberg and Cunnin being joined by Barclay Goodrow. So Goodrow still somehow manages to avoid ever being on the Sharks' fourth line. Seems to be written in the deal that brought him here that he has to be in the Sharks' top nine. And this line actually started the game off exceptionally well for the Sharks. They came out with a ton of energy. They actually had the first shift of the entire game. The opening faceoff, Cunnin is skating well, he's hitting hard, he's throwing a couple checks, so is Goodrow. Wenberg's getting in there, and then on their second shift of the game, they scored this goal that puts the Sharks up 1-0, and you're thinking, like, this is a line that's really going to pull it together and lead the way for the Sharks here tonight. But then it just kind of fell off a cliff in the latter part of this game. Wenberg, he is someone who really likes to slow the game down. That's something we have seen all throughout the first 35 games of this season when he has been on the ice. He does this in both the offensive zone and the defensive zone. It's something that he does find some success with. Here tonight, though, I think he was just a little bit too slow a couple of times. There were moments here tonight in which he's trying to do this and he's just abused by the Oilers' speed. There was one in which he's chasing after a loose puck in the defensive zone, but for whatever reason, instead of actually going after it to get it, he's skating very slowly into it for some reason, even though he's got an Oilers player behind him who then wins the battle along the boards and gets possession for Edmonton. This should have been an easy clear out for the Sharks, but Wenberg, for whatever reason, doesn't do that. And so there were mistakes for sure from him, but I thought all in all he wasn't horrible. The same would go for Luke Cunnin, who I thought was actually playing a pretty admirable game here tonight. Plus, he gets this goal, his 9th of the season, so you can't be upset by that. And then, of course, there's Barclay Goodrow, who also had tons of mistakes, but unlike Wenberg and Cunnin, who had some bright spots, Goodrow didn't really have much. As I mentioned, his first couple of shifts were rather solid, but then it just went downhill from there. And of course, he was on the ice in the 6-on-5 situation. He should have been able to try and get a better clear-out attempt than he did in these dying seconds. That could have potentially put the game away for the Sharks if he was able to pull that one off, and yet he was not. And so Goodrow, as I've already mentioned earlier on, the fact that he's still on a third line and completely avoiding the fourth is just mind-blowing to me. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, we have Sturm and Grundstrom being joined by Will Smith. So Will Smith finds himself on this fourth line as a punishment, I guess, for the turnover he had in the game against the Avalanche just a couple of days ago. I still stand by the fact that Smith was put in a horrific position by a terrible pass from Nikolai Kovalenko, and Smith has really no other recourse here when he's surrounded by a couple of Avalanche players from both behind him and in front of him. But I guess Warsofsky does not agree with me. I don't have control of the lines, and so he finds himself on this fourth line, which is a bad choice for a couple of reasons. The first of which is, of course, that it limits the amount of ice time that he's able to get. Sure, the Sharks are hemmed into their own zone so much that you would expect the fourth line to not get as many shifts, but even in other games in which the Sharks are actually playing okay, the fourth line still ends up with less than 10 minutes of ice time, and Smith indeed falls in that category, just 9 minutes here, which I believe, if I'm not mistaken, is a season low. But on top of that, there's just not really a lot of jam from these two other players. This isn't a comment of talking about poorly either Sturm or Grundstrom, but we saw early in this first period, Smith tries for a couple of moves here, but Sturm plays a way in which it's just chip the puck in, go to work, forecheck hard. Smith doesn't really play that way at all. It's not really either of these players' faults. It's just a clash of play styles between them. So stylistically, this is just not a smart choice. But again, I guess the punishment of the turnover weighs out any actual smart lineup decision making. I would have been perfectly fine if Smith found himself on this third line with Wenberg and Cudden, especially since he has been pretty solid from an offensive perspective. And then if later on in the game you wanted more of a defensive option, to have Goodrow and Smith swap. But in the early parts of this game, Smith finding himself in the fourth line just doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. Now, when it comes to how he actually played here tonight, I actually thought Smith was rather solid. I have seen other sentiments online that they were not a big fan of Smith's game here tonight, but I actually have to disagree with that. In the first period, I thought it was a bit slow for sure because of a couple of those moments where he just doesn't really have the chemistry with Sturm and Grundstrom. But I actually thought Smith was surprisingly solid defensively. He found himself on the ice a couple of times against both Draisaitl and McDavid, and I thought he actually held his own rather well. There weren't a ton of great chances generated by the Oilers when Smith was on the ice. There weren't moments in which he was finding himself completely lost in the defensive zone, which with the structure that the Sharks play and with how smart and great the Oilers are offensively is not an easy thing to do, but he was swapping off coverage exceptionally well up high near the blue line. So I was actually impressed with the effort that Smith had in the latter parts of this game. He didn't get many shifts, obviously, but I still thought he was pretty decent. When it comes to the Sharks' defensive pairings, obviously what is important to mention here is that the Sharks, they got caved in. They played in the defensive zone. Over the last 40 minutes of this game, they were probably in their own zone for at least 30 of them. It was not really pretty, and so it's hard to really come into this and say, well, this defenseman was exceptional. There's nobody who really falls under that umbrella here tonight, but there were some who were certainly better than others. We start off with the Sharks' first defensive pairing of Wallman and Ceci. I liked the start of this game for Jake Wallman, but I think the frustration really built up in him as it went on. The fact that the Sharks were not getting any O-zone time, which of course is where Wallman does thrive, and the fact that they were struggling to clear the zone so significantly, the frustration seemed to build up, and Wallman started to have sort of like a fine, I'll do it myself type of attitude, which can be okay, but we saw him get burned a couple of times for that. There was one moment where he tries to deke through a couple of Oilers in the neutral zone, and he gets beat by Leon Draisaitl, which turns out to a great chance for the Oilers. So it's something that Wallman will have to kind of rein in, and it felt as though it kind of got him a little frazzled for the rest of this game, as the third period was not really kind to Jake Wallman, but at least the start was all right. His defensive partner, Cody Ceci, I was actually a bit more impressed with. Maybe this is because Ceci was against his former team, but he actually seemed semi-comfortable with actually defending against what the Oilers were doing. Obviously not great, and not being able to take the puck away or anything like that, or consistently clear the zone, but he was actually doing an okay job of keeping things further to the perimeter. He perhaps knows the tendencies of these types of players like Hyman, Draisaitl, McDavid, Nugent-Hopkins, all of these guys. So I thought Ceci played a pretty decent game. When it comes to the Sharks' second defensive pairing, Liljegren does draw back into the lineup, unsurprisingly so, I would say. And I thought Liljegren was actually perhaps the Sharks' best defenseman of the night. There were mistakes, as there were with every single one of these players. There was one moment where he gets the puck right in front of his own net, attempts to clear, but kind of fans on it, and it's kept in by the Oilers, and they continue to press after that. But in terms of just general D-zone play, which is something that usually Liljegren is not the best at, I actually thought he looked really good here tonight, again, in comparison to the rest of the Sharks players, not just generally. And so I was happy to see Liljegren respond to that benching pretty well. When it comes to Mario Ferraro, it again goes back to what I mentioned in my last review of the Avalanche game, where there are some shifts in which Ferraro is surprisingly very solid. He had some tough matchups, as did every single defenseman here. McDavid, Draisaitl, I've mentioned these names so many times already. They're tough players to cover. And Ferraro, I think a few times he won battles. He separated them from the puck. He was a good player. But then there was at least 5 or 6 times in this game, different shifts in which Ferraro comes out and he's just an entirely different player, where it's mistake after mistake. There's times where he's stepping up aggressively in the neutral zone, even though McDavid is facing him with speed. That's literally the one player amongst all else in the league who you don't want to be doing this against, and yet he is. There are moments where he's just making these poor reads. He's flicking pucks out of the zone in situations where he should not be doing so. There's moments where he has time to actually make a smarter play, and yet he just flicks it off his stick for absolutely zero reason. So Ferraro just continues to be such a frustrating player on the ice. There's so much good, but there is so much more bad as well. It's this really, really ugly relationship, honestly, when it comes to Ferraro's game, where Warsofsky is certainly able to forgive the bad for the good, but for us as fans and for myself as well, it's getting more and more difficult to actually do that. There's a lot of bad. And when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, Thrun and Ruda, so no Mukhamadullin here tonight. I'm not surprised to see that. I'm slightly disappointed, I guess, because I'd love to see the Sharks develop their younger defensive talent, but maybe going up against the Oilers, that would have been a bit of a tough matchup that they didn't want to have Mukhamadullin actually have to go through. So he steps out, Liljegren comes back in, Ruda remains in the lineup here as well. This was a solid enough third pairing for the Sharks. It's mostly because they didn't have to face a lot of those tougher matchups. Rarely did Thrun actually find himself on the ice against either Draisaitl or McDavid. It happened a couple of times for sure, but not all that often. And so he actually ended up having both of these guys all right enough games. And then when it comes to the Sharks goaltender, I already talked about him a lot earlier on, but to kind of circle back here, Yaroslav Askarov gets the start here tonight. I cannot even begin to imagine the score of this game if it was Alexander Georgiev in nets for the Sharks. Not only is Georgiev like an average goaltender, he's even worse than that. He's one of the worst goalies in the league this season, and so with the absolute shooting clinic the Oilers put on, this could have been one of those ugly like 7-2 losses, or perhaps even identical to the one right near the end of last season, a 9-2 loss. But Askarov, he stood tall, he's so solid in the net, he plays a very unique style, he's not going down as quickly. He's actually willing to stay standing up and use his 6'3" size to his advantage, and he seemed to be making the Oilers' lives extremely difficult throughout much of this night. Very, very strong. The playing with the puck could use a little bit of work still. We saw him try to do that a lot in this game. There were moments where he's actually even skating with it pretty aggressively and then kind of not making much play happen after that. But from an actual goaltending perspective, he was stellar. He was lights out. You were hopeful that the Sharks would have been able to pull the victory out for him, because he certainly did deserve it. And going into the next game on Monday, it's hard to justify keeping Askarov out of the net, because Georgiev is very clearly not the correct option for them. We'll see if that ends up winning out, perhaps from a tanking perspective. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Monday, the final game before the 3-day Christmas break, the 3 days off, also on the road here, and the Sharks will be facing off against the Vancouver Canucks. It gets a little easier for sure. The Canucks don't exactly have the same level of talent as the Oilers, but they're still a very good team, and we shall see if the Sharks can maybe end this losing streak for themselves and go into that Christmas break on a high note. Class dismissed.